All
Hi,
right.
everybody. Welcome. It's really great to see y'all today. So we're just going to wait a few more minutes, see if anybody else joins in. We don't want them to miss out on today's great program. Just as a reminder to please keep your microphones muted during the program. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. Hi, everybody. Oh my goodness, I see lots of excited faces today.
Ooh, looks like a whole group there. Hi, everybody.
Mhm.
Hi, look at that. Oh, how wonderful.
Oh, wow. Looks like we have a whole class today.
Get your
Hi.
wiggles out before the program starts. Get them out. Get your wiggles out. Oh, yes. Good, good, good. Excellent. This is so lovely. Kelly, look at the audience you have today.
I see that.
Is this
Okay.
it looks like we have two different classes of children. Is that right? Nice. You can put it in the chat if you want to. You can, the teacher can put the information in the chat or the parent. We'd love to just know who you are, what zip code you're in. Maybe
All right.
Kelly can show you a cool fish picture too.
Oh, we'll get to some cool fish pictures, I promise.
Awesome. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. I am Daisy. I work at the sixth floor of the Dallas Public Library, the Central Library downtown. I don't know if you've ever been, but it's a really cool building. Um, really excited to see everybody here today. Lots of excited faces. Our topic today is really, really cool. I'm excited to learn some things today. I'm going to go ahead and hand the mic over to Judy from the Office of Environmental Quality and Sustainability. And Judy, welcome.
Thank you so much and welcome everybody and all you folks of all different ages. Thank you so much for being with us today for Earth Day every day. It's Earth Day every day, isn't it? So, and definitely our weather is reminding us of that, that we need to make the planet our priority. So I'm Judy Schmidt. As Daisy said, I'm with the Office of Environmental Quality and Sustainability for the City of Dallas. And what we do is we focus on all kinds of aspects of the environment: air quality, energy, water conservation, stormwater, zero waste. You all know about zero waste and recycling and all that, right? And also urban agriculture. So you know about growing herbs in your garden and different plants and how to take care of that. So, as I said, the planet is definitely reminding us that we need to do everything we can to take care of it. So, this is Plastic Free July. We still have a couple of days left, so do everything you can not to use any plastic that you don't need, and don't buy any new plastic. Use your reusable bags and water bottles, things of that nature. And then also, just want to remind you that we need to try to conserve water in all this heat. This heat is really intense. So, anything you can do. I know you kiddos sometimes like to take long showers or long baths filling up the water. Don't do it right now. We need to try to conserve water. So, I want to tell you what an exciting program we have. And it's so thrilling to have Kelly Drennan back on with us. She's a returning guest speaker, and that makes us very proud. And we're also very proud of our relationship with the Dallas Public Library. Um, and Because we've had this relationship to be able to bring these free programs to everyone for the past 2 years. So it's a very, very exciting thing. I want to tell you a little bit about Kelly, who'll be speaking to you. She does something really wonderful. And for all of you on the call today, um, she actually works with sea gardens, gardens that are under the ocean. And so she's going to tell you a little bit about that and give you a lesson of biology in Coral 101. So it's just very different from what I do every day and maybe what you all do, and where she actually is stationed and all the things she's able to participate in. So she's going to share about that. So Kelly is actually from the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary, which is off the coast of the United States. And Kelly is an education and outreach specialist with the National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, Flower Bank National Marine Sanctuary. And she has been teaching marine science as an informal educator for over 30 years, including her position in education at Moody Gardens and SeaWorld of Florida. I bet some of you have been there. She is also a certified elementary school teacher in Texas, and she has taught fourth grade for 2 years in South Houston in the past. Her work with the sanctuary includes community events, presentations, conferences, teacher workshops, lesson development, social media, and the sanctuary's website. She also collaborates with zoos and aquariums. So you see, you all are in really good hands today. She is also, are you ready? A certified scuba diver. Isn't that something? That's definitely on my bucket list. I would love to be a scuba diver. And she has occasionally assisted with offshore research and monitoring activities. That means that she's actually been able to go to the ocean and do research and monitoring activities, under the water. So Kelly has a bachelor's degree in Spanish with a minor in mathematics from James Madison University in Virginia. And she is really a great speaker, and I'm so happy and proud to welcome her to the virtual podium today for Earth Day Every Day, Coral 101.
Thank you, Judy. It's very good to be here. Thank you, Daisy. Everybody working behind the scenes to make this happen. I'm excited to see that we have a whole class out there, and it looks like we have a camp group out there, and then all sorts of people tuning in from home. So thanks for joining us today. So today we're calling this class Coral 101. That's the way you list things in a university. So we're going to pretend we're college students today. And a 101 class means it's a very beginning level class on a certain topic.
Hey, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing okay. So I'm here, and if they don't have to be all the same thing, I can go out to Eco Park and get some stuff to put in the...
Okay, I think we're good now. I think they muted. All right. So what we're going to talk about today is just, getting you familiar with coral. But first, we're going to talk about the place where these corals are off the coast of Texas and Louisiana. So starting there. Today, we're going to be talking about marine protected areas of the National Marine Sanctuary System. National marine sanctuaries are similar to national parks, but they're all underwater. And like national parks, they protect important habitats, important types of animals, and historic artifacts, which underwater would be shipwrecks. But they're all still places you can visit and enjoy if you have a way to get there. What we're going to talk about today is kind of far offshore, so you'd have to have a good boat to get out there. But there are other national marine sanctuaries that come right up to the beaches and are a lot easier to get into. Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary, where you see the yellow star here, is the only national marine sanctuary in the Gulf of Mexico, and it's home to beautiful, thriving coral reefs over 100 miles offshore. And this is the question we get most often. There's a coral reef where? Everybody thinks of the Florida Keys, they think of Mexico, the Bahamas, all these exotic places in the Caribbean and out in the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, but nobody thinks of Texas when they think of coral reefs. So let's take a look. The yellow box in this inset map shows where the sanctuary is located in relation to Texas and Louisiana. So you see Texas over here on the left, Louisiana over here on the right, and that's the border right between. If you came straight down, it would cut right between these two little guys here, which are West Flower Garden Bank and East Flower Garden Bank. The border comes right through this area of the bigger map, okay? The main map shows the closer view of all these separate pieces that make up the sanctuary. All these red places here, 19 separate pieces that cover 17 different banks or little underwater mountains that we found out there offshore. These are anywhere from 80 to 125 miles from land and create a chain of protected habitats for important species across the northwestern Gulf of Mexico. And the connections between these banks, you can see on the map, there are some ridges and things that actually connect things together. So those are geological connections. But in our explorations, we've also found that there are biological connections. We find a lot of the same creatures living from one area to the next, and that's the reason they're all part of the same sanctuary. When Flower Garden Banks was designated in 1992, it consisted of just two banks, East Flower Garden Bank and West Flower Garden Bank. And the coral reefs we'll be talking about today are right on top of these banks. And they were the reason that this area was first designated. And then in 1996, Congress decided to add Stetson Bank to the sanctuary. And on top of this bank, we have what we call a coral community. And I'll explain more about that later. And then in January of last year, the remaining reefs and banks were added to the sanctuary to protect additional coral communities and a variety of mesophotic or deeper low light habitats out there in the Gulf of Mexico. The reef habitats of the sanctuary fall into three main categories, and you've just heard me mention them all: coral reefs, coral communities, and mesophotic habitats. Those are those deeper low light habitats. And while all of them contain some type of coral, today we're going to focus specifically on the shallow coral reefs, the relatively shallow coral reefs of the sanctuary, although ours starts 60 feet underwater, so it's still kind of deep. So as I mentioned earlier, the coral reefs are at East and West Flower Garden Banks, and these were the original reason for the sanctuary's designation. And this is what they look like. Yes, the water is that clear out there. Right up along our coastline, it tends to be kind of muddy looking. If you've ever been to the coast of Galveston, it kind of looks brownish green in the water. And that's because we have the Mississippi River nearby in Louisiana, and all the sediments coming out of that river kind of float right along our coastline. But if you get out further, it's really clear and crystal blue like this. And so this photo here is showing you just how deep it is. Look, that's our boat up at the surface, a diver on the way down to the reef, and then the reef below. And the top of the reef is at least 60 feet underwater. And then the sandy area you see here is at least 80 feet underwater. So we're looking at a really it's a shallow reef compared to the other stuff we have, but it's deeper than your average reef where you might go snorkeling in Florida, for example. These are the northernmost reefs in the Gulf of Mexico. Most of what we have here are big brain and star corals, and they're also the healthiest coral reefs in the whole Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico. And one of the ways we know this is that over half of the bottom is covered in these living corals. So while this looks like a whole bunch of rocks here, that's all living coral you're seeing there. And we have as much as 5 times the amount of other reefs in the whole Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico. And as you can see from this picture, the coral formations on our reefs have literally piled up on top of one another over thousands of years. And some of these corals grow quite large, some as big as small cars even. Now, to give you a point of reference, this little fish here, he's about 5 inches long, about the span of my hand here, right? And if we use that as a measurement, that means that this big coral here on the left, that's one of our star corals, is as much as 5 feet wide. Okay, that doesn't even tell us how tall it is. So that's really big for a coral. And then you can see lots of cool little brain corals here. Look, they look just like people's brains in the way they are shaped. And while piled up coral covers most of the reef cap, there are some sandy areas as well. You can see some of that here. And these sand flats, you can see from the sand flats, the corals come up 15 to 20 feet. So this is something we call high profile reef. And most of the sand here is actually crushed coral skeleton, thanks in large part to parrotfish. Parrotfish love to munch on the reef in search of algae. And as they do that, they munch on pieces of coral skeleton, but they can't digest that. So those hard bits of skeleton pass right on through the parrotfish and come out the other end as poop, but we know it as sand. So most of the sand around our coral reef is actually parrotfish poop. Kind of a fun fact there for your day. And of course, coral reefs are more than just coral. We have sponges and algae. And right here, you see these bright reddish color and bright orange. Those are big, huge sponges growing underneath these brain corals. Down here at the bottom, this green stuff is a leafy algae. So we do get sponges and algae that grow in between and fill in all those crannies, those nooks and crevices between the different corals. So everything on the reef is important habitat for something. Boulder-shaped corals are the main kinds of shapes we see out there, but there are some branching corals here too. Most of the time, they're not as noticeable because they're smaller colonies and they're tucked in between, kind of like those sponges were tucked between the bigger corals. But some areas, like this picture here, we have whole patches of these little branching corals. And then you see a brain coral in between and some star and brain corals in the distance, but lots of the smaller corals, branching corals are available in certain areas as well. And together, all of these reefs provide habitat for a variety of Caribbean species of fish, invertebrates, turtles, and mammals. We don't have as much diversity as the rest of the Caribbean because we're just too far from those other reefs. This map shows us that we're over almost 800 miles to the Florida Keys and almost 500 miles to the nearest reefs in Mexico. So we're way up here in the Northern Gulf, and it's a place where it takes animals a while to travel up there. So not all of the things that are found on those other reefs have found their way up here closer to Texas and Louisiana. But what we do have is a wonderful balanced group of wildlife that's out there on our reefs. So let's take a look. We have, starting here with invertebrates. These are animals that have no backbone, and a lot of them are squishy, but some of them are hard and spiny, but none of them have backbones. So no skeletons inside these guys, and they like to hide in all the nooks and crannies in the reef. You probably recognize the octopus right here and the sea urchins up here on top, but maybe not these spirally organisms down here at the bottom. These are Christmas tree worms. Yes, worms can be pretty. You probably think of your earthworms that crawl out in your gardens or whenever there's too much rain and they get kind of soggy in the ground, they come out onto the sidewalks. Well, these worms kind of look like that, but on the very end, they have these beautiful gills. So most of their body is hiding inside of a tube that the corals grow around, and then they just stick their gills out the top of the tube. So each pair of gills here belongs to one worm. You see there's an orange one here on the right, and a yellow one in the middle, and a yellow and white one on the left. So that's 3 different worms you're seeing there, and all you're really seeing is just their gills. But we also have brightly colored fish. This is what you expect on a tropical reef, right? Cool fish that you get to see. So the bright colored ones, like the angelfish up here on the top and this little tiny damselfish on the bottom, blues and yellows and greens and all sorts of colors. And look at this parrotfish. He's got the blue and green going, a little bit of a mustache going on here too. Look at those buck teeth on that. That's typical of a parrotfish. That's how they crunch the corals on the reef and get to the algae. But we also have some oddly shaped fishes out on the coral reefs, like this kind of puffer fish. It's called a balloon fish. And when it's scared or feels like it's threatened, it can puff its body up by sucking in water and making itself as big as a balloon. And then all those spines on its body will stick straight out. And that makes it so it's kind of hard to eat. I see somebody pretending to be a balloon fish there in the audience. That's a great job. And then we have these guys over here. These are actually the same kind of fish. They look completely different, don't they, except for their shape. Their shape is actually like a triangle. If you look at them from the front, it's a triangle. So they're flat on one side, flat on the other side, and flat on the bottom, making that triangle shape. And they have those special little lips that just kind of push out right there in the front so they can squirt water at the bottom and uncover food that they'd like to eat. But what's really cool is at the flower garden banks, we have the black and white ones here that you find all over the rest of the Caribbean, but we also have this gold one. And the flower garden banks is just about the only place in the world you're going to find that. So it's the same fish, but a little bit different color. And I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention the really big animals out there, the really awe-inspiring, what we call megafauna, or big animals. Whale sharks come by these reefs in the summertime. Sea turtles and manta rays are out there all year round. And in fact, the area around the flower garden banks is a manta nursery. We see mostly juvenile or baby mantas out there. So they tend to be smaller than people see in other places. And we finally realized why. It's because they're young ones. They're not grown-ups. So it's really cool that we have a manta nursery out there. And that means that since all these things like to congregate around here, that these coral reefs really are special. So now that we've talked about what an amazing place a coral reef can be, let's talk about how a coral reef is formed. There are many different types of corals in the world, and they're all in the ocean. Some of them are considered hard corals, some are soft corals. Some live in warm water, some live in cold water, some live in shallower water, some are way down deep. So there's all different kinds of corals. But today, from this point forward, we're going to be talking specifically about reef building corals. These are also known as hard, stony, or hexacorals. Those are all those words listed there. So everything you see here that's a coral, the brain coral, the star coral, this branching coral here, this mustard hill coral, all these are hard, stony, or hexacorals. And we call those all reef building corals because they actually build all this habitat by creating a stony substrate. And because reef building corals actually build visible structure in the ocean, there's often confusion about how they are classified. Are they animals, plants, or minerals? What do you think? All right, you got an idea in your head what you think? All right, let's check and see if you're right. Guess what? They're all three. Scientifically, scientists classify these as animals, and they're in the phylum Cnidaria along with jellies and anemones. And the coral animal is actually a collection of polyps, and that's all the little pieces you see here. They look like little miniature sea anemones, don't they? So the coral animal is a whole collection of these polyps, and it's a each polyp is a fleshy tube. It's kind of soft and squishy, has a mouth in the middle, like you can see right here, each of these little slits that looks like in the top, that's the mouth, and then the tentacles in a ring around that. And these tentacles contain stinging cells called nematocysts or cnidoblasts, and they use those to sting and catch prey in the water. In reef-building corals, these tentacles are always in multiples of 6. Have you guys been learning your times tables in school? So the 6 times tables means that there could be 6 tentacles. Looks like these guys have more than 6 tentacles, right? 12, 18, 24, 30, 36. Really depends on the coral. Each one's different, but I guarantee you that these are all in multiples of 6 if you're talking about a reef-building coral. The picture over here on the right is if you took a cross section. So that means if you cut it in half down the middle and looked at it, this is a drawing of what it would look like. So you can see the mouth at the top and going right down into the hollow part in the middle, which is their stomach, the tentacles around the top. And you can see here that their skin connects to the next polyp over. So if you look here in the picture, you can see they're all connected one to the next. And that's what makes up the whole animal that is called a coral. The plant part of coral is a symbiotic algae that lives in the tissues. Most people think of corals as being very colorful, but reef-building coral polyps are actually clear. They're transparent. You can see right through them. The color you're seeing in the picture comes from algae that live inside their tissue, inside their skin. And that algae is known as zooxanthellae. That's that big Z word you see up here. So little tiny microscopic algae. This is a picture from a microscope of what these algae look like. And then if you look at this close-up photo in the middle, you can see a little bit of the algae right there inside of the clear polyp. When you look at it all told, you're going to see the orangey and green colors right here. That all comes from different algae that live inside their skin. And even the name zooxanthellae, that big Z word, tells you it's a yellowish plant associated with an animal. This beginning part, zoo, means animal. Think of a zoo is full of animals, right? Xan, zan, means yellow. And thele means plant. So we're talking about yellow plants that live in an animal. We know they're not all yellow. Some of them are green or orange or red or whatever, brown, but you get the idea. So they name these algae for what they do. They're an algae that give color to the corals that they live inside of. And then the mineral part of a coral is its skeleton. This calcium carbonate structure, we also call that limestone, is created by and laid down in layers beneath the polyp. So look, here's that diagram again. Remember, this orange part here is the polyp itself, right? And you see this other tan part underneath? That's the skeleton in this drawing. And these little, look like stones underneath, those are the different layers that the coral is building underneath itself. So it creates this stony thing underneath. So the coral lives on top of its skeleton. Instead of the skeleton being inside like you and me, where our bones are inside, that's our skeleton. The skeleton of a coral is this stony object that is underneath. So this picture right here on the left is a skeleton from a dead coral. If it was alive, it would be orangey green, whatever color on top, like you saw those polyps in the other picture. But what you can see here is the little circles, the little openings in the surface. That's where each little coral polyp sits. See, it's a round circle. And this part in the drawing, it's almost like its feet. It sticks part of its body down into those little nooks. Those little spots you see, there are open spaces in a circle together. And then the coral can pull completely down inside of that if it wants. It's like a little cup that the coral sits in on top of its skeleton. So it builds a cup around its bottom, and it can pull all the way inside, or it can stretch out and put its tentacles out, either way it wants to. So when you look at a reef, it may look like stone, but it actually has a living layer on top. Now, how do you think corals feed? Look at this picture. It might give you an idea. First glance, it seems that reef-building corals like jellies and anemones would feed mostly with their tentacles. And they do feed with their tentacles, but that's not where they get most of their food. Most of their food comes from the process of photosynthesis. That symbiotic algae that lives in their tissues is so important that corals can't live without it because they rely on the photosynthesis. Remember, plants use the sunlight to create oxygen, which we use as people, right? They also create food, they create sugars, and that helps feed the coral polyps. And that food is up to 70 to 75% of all the nutrients that these corals need to survive. They get the remainder of their nutrients by capturing small plankton with their stinging tentacles. So they do use their tentacles and those stinging cells in there to capture things. They call that raptorial feeding. And then some of it they absorb directly from the ocean. So the chemicals they need to help build the stony skeleton come from the seawater around them. How do you get more corals? How do they reproduce? Well, reef-building corals reproduce both sexually and asexually. They reproduce asexually to expand the size of a colony. So imagine that your coral started out as one little polyp and you want more. So what it does is it splits in two, and that's what this drawing is showing. It's one polyp and it starts to pinch together in the middle until it's two polyps sitting right next to each other. And then it does that again and again and again. So you get more and more polyps. As every single one keeps splitting and dividing, you get more and more polyps until you've created an entire colony of polyps. So when you the pictures we saw where they're all those polyps together, that was created from one original one that just kept splitting and dividing. And that's how an individual coral colony grows. But corals also reproduce sexually, often through something called mass spawning. And that creates the larvae that float in the water and then settle down and start new corals in different places. And when those corals settle down, that's where a new colony starts. So if you have an existing colony, you want those polyps to keep splitting, to keep spreading and making the coral bigger. But if you want a new one to start somewhere, you need to have eggs and sperm that mix together in the water column. And this happens during our mass spawning at the flower garden banks, usually once or twice a year. 7 to 10 days after the full moon in August, our corals will start releasing all their eggs and sperm up in the water. And that's what you're seeing here. All these little bundles have eggs and sperm in them. Here's a close-up of a brain coral where it's getting ready to release those up into the water. And they release those up and they all mix together and they fertilize the eggs. And then you have these little larvae, these little tiny microscopic little swimmy things that eventually settle down on the bottom and turn into coral polyps. And that mass spawning usually occurs, like I said, in August. But if we have full moon really early in August or really late in July, sometimes we see two spawnings. We'll see one in August and one in September. And the timing for that varies from reef to reef. But ours this year is taking place this week. So the coral spawning is actually going on right this week out there in the flower garden banks. I mean, not this week in August. Sorry. I forgot we're in July. I'm already thinking ahead to August. So it's next month, about a month from now, you're going to see the coral spawning out there. And last but not least, what kind of habitat do you think that supports reef building corals? Do you think you find corals in cold places? Not the reef building corals. Remember I said some corals are found in cold places, but the ones that build reefs are always found in relatively warm places. So let's look at our list. Number one, corals need a hard surface to attach to. Remember that larvae swims around after it's been fertilized and it has to settle down to the bottom and then it sticks its bottom to the ground, just like an anemone does. You know, it uses its bottom of its body to suction itself right onto the bottom. It needs a hard place to do that. If it lands in the sand, it's not going to survive. And it needs clear water so sunlight can come streaming through. It needs lots of light for that photosynthesis to take place, where all those algae in there are creating the food for the corals. And it needs moving water because corals are stuck to the bottom. They can't get up and move around and swim around and find a new place. The food has to come to them. And the only way that happens is if the water is moving. So the food that they catch with their tentacles comes by in the floating water. And then they need warm water. The corals out at the flower garden banks like the temperature between 68 and 86 degrees Fahrenheit. And you know, water is usually cooler than the air, right? So they wouldn't like our air temperature right now very much. We're up in the 90s these last few weeks here in Texas, right? Well, our water gets really warm. As the air gets really warm, the water gets warmer too. And sometimes that can be a problem for the corals. If it's too cold or it's too warm, the corals will not survive. So we've got these beautiful coral reefs out there. We know now how they formed. But what happens if it does get too hot? Well, that has to do with climate change. Like I said, our oceans are getting warmer and warmer and warmer. But there's a lot of things that can threaten corals. And this is a little chart that comes from our from NOAA that kind of shows all the different things. They can get diseases. They can have pollution come offshore and smother or bury them. They can get kicked around by divers and snorkelers. They can get broken by people dropping anchors. We can end up with too much algae, and then the water, when the water turns all green and dark, then not enough sunlight gets through and the corals won't be able to survive. And if there's not enough moving water, if the water sits perfectly still for too long, then they're going to run out of food and things that they can catch with their tentacles. But the two biggest things threatening corals right now are things we call coral bleaching and ocean acidification. And ocean acidification has a lot to do with chemistry, so we're not going to talk about that today because I think that's a little too complicated. But we are going to talk about coral bleaching because this is something you hear about in the news all the time. Coral bleaching describes a situation where corals lose their symbiotic algae and turn white. So this is what you're seeing in this picture. This is a picture we took out on the reefs at the Flower Garden Bank several years ago. And look, some of these corals have turned white, and some of them are starting to turn white. You can see they're getting paler, but they still have a little bit of color, and others look perfectly fine. So every coral responds differently, but what happens is when they get too hot, the water gets too warm, those algae start acting badly, and then the corals don't want them there because it becomes dangerous for the corals, so they kick them out. They actually spit them out. They spit the algae right out. It's like they just kind of throw up the algae right out there into the water and make the algae go away. And then, but remember, those algae give them their color. So once the algae's gone, their color's gone, and that's why they look white, because you're seeing through the clear coral all the way to that white skeleton underneath. Remember that picture of the skeleton I showed you? That white skeleton? That is the coral skeleton color is white. So it looks white, but that does not mean it's dead. The good news is that it doesn't mean necessarily that a coral will die. It might. If it stays too hot too long, and the bleaching goes on too long, then the coral is going to die because it's not going to get most of its food. But when coral bleaching starts, it means the coral's starting to starve. It can still catch stuff with its tentacles, but it's missing the biggest part of its diet, which is from photosynthesis, from those algae. And so if things correct themselves, if the water cools down soon enough, then corals will take in new algae and they can become healthy again. But even if corals survive, which ours do, right now we have 99% survival rate of the corals out on our reefs. So very few of them actually die from coral bleaching right now on the Flower Garden Bank's reefs. But that's not the same with coral reefs around the world. Coral reefs that are already in trouble because of pollution or overfishing or damage or disease, when the coral bleaching comes along, it very often does kill them because that's just too many things going on and hurting the corals. So even after they recover, it's kind of like you being sick. You know, we've heard a lot about people being sick in these last couple of years. And even after they get over being sick, they're still a little slow. They're still a little tired. It takes your body a while to get back to 100% ready to go and completely active, right? It takes your body, it's a slow process. Same thing for the corals. So even if the bleaching goes away, that doesn't mean they're really super healthy right away. They're still more at risk right after they've had a bleaching event than they would be under normal circumstances. So we don't like to see bleaching happen, but it's something that's happening more and more these days because our planet is getting warmer. So that said, if you don't remember any of this, that's okay, because we have places for you to look it up on the web. So we have a website called flowergarden.noaa.gov. That's the name there, and the librarians will share that information with you after the program if you like. And on our webpage there, we have a Learn section that you can go to. And when you go to the landing page there, you're going to find a section just for students there. If you want to go find, we have some coloring pages and word puzzles and things like that. And we have some fun facts about the sanctuary. But look, we also have a whole section there all about corals. And you can see some of the same pictures I showed you today. You can learn about the coral biology. You can learn about coral bleaching. You can learn about coral spawning. All the things we've talked about today are right here in this section. So really great place for you to go and learn more after this class is over. That's that coral section right there. And then if you and or your parents want to keep hearing from us and learning about the sanctuary, because it is a really cool place and it's not just about the coral, there's lots of stuff going on. We have email lists on our website, and those are in the news section of the website. And and there's different lists you can sign up, but one is just called Sanctuary Updates. And you can just every so often get an email from us telling you about the great things going on in the sanctuary right now. And then we also have social media. Over here on the side, we are on Facebook and Twitter, and that's our handle at FGBNMS. And I forgot to add here, we're now on Instagram also, and that's at Flower Garden Banks NMS. I'll write that in the chat box right now. That's on Instagram. Okay, so if you'd like to stay connected with us, we post really cool pictures in the sanctuary all the time on our social media. And I think that takes us to the very end. There's a picture of just examples of all the wonderful, beautiful, colorful wildlife that lives out there on these coral reefs right off the coast of Texas and Louisiana. So things are healthy right now. These are the healthiest coral reefs in the Caribbean, but we want them to stay that way. They're really important places for all these plants and animals that live out in the Gulf of Mexico, and we've chosen to protect them because of how important they are. Now it's up to us to make sure it stays healthy, and how we treat it today, what we do here on land, definitely affects the health of that reef tomorrow. Thanks, everybody. And I'm happy to take questions at this time. Daisy, how do you want to manage questions?
If you have a question, go ahead and type it into the chat. If you raise your hand on Zoom, I can unmute you and you can ask your question out loud. Ooh, I see lots of questions.
I do
Lots of
too.
hands raised. Let's see. Give me one moment. Okay.
I see one in the chat box right now. What role will NOAA have if or when wind turbines are installed in the Gulf? That was just in the newspaper yesterday, the day before, how they're looking at installing them out here in the Gulf. So far, it looks like the areas they're considering are very far away from the Flower Garden Banks. So it shouldn't have an impact on the sanctuary right now. But NOAA is one of the consulting agencies in these processes, because NOAA is more than just the sanctuary. It is weather service, it is the fisheries service, it's ocean exploration, it's all different things. So there's all different parts of NOAA that could be affected by putting wind turbines out there in the Gulf of Mexico. And so it's really important that NOAA is part of that consultation process. So they are an advising agency. It looks like, you know, there's always a lead agency that has to get the approvals or takes in all the public comment and things like that. But NOAA would be considered a consulting agency in those processes. Great question. All right, do we want to tackle the kids there with Charla Harris?
Yes, I'm gonna ask them to unmute and they can start asking their questions.
And if one person, if just the teacher could say the question right up near the microphone, that way I'll be sure I can hear it clearly.
All right, everybody hands down with us. Zion, what's your question?
My question is why is the algae dangerous to the coral when it gets too hot?
Why is the algae dangerous to the coral when it gets too hot?
You know, that's something that scientists are still trying to understand. That's a really good question. What happens is they kind of photosynthesize too much and it actually becomes toxic. So it's kind of like, you know, when you have a virus in your belly and it makes your stomach upset, right? And if the virus multiplies and becomes more and it does a whole lot more, then sometimes you end up with worse than just an upset stomach, right? You might lose things out the top or the bottom. Well, same kind of thing. The algae, because when it gets too warm, it starts doing too much photosynthesis, and that has the same kind of effect on the coral. It makes the coral very upset and needs to spit it out and get rid of it.
Okay.
But I don't know the exact chemical process. That's a good question, though.
Olivia, what's your question? Put your hands down.
How many types of sharks are there?
Jonathan.
Oh, she's asking about coral. Do you have a question about coral? You go ahead. What's your question? Mark.
What's that picture that is
Which one?
like the Which one that color?
Come point to it. Point to which creature.
The orange one?
The
This-
orange creature?
This one in the middle?
He's talking about the shrimp.
This one?
I just starfish.
Yes, the one in the middle.
Okay, the one in the middle. These are called brittle stars. They're related to starfish, but instead of having big, thick arms, they have skinny arms and they move around kind of snake-like. So the middle is solid, and then these arms are, we call it serpentine. They can squiggle around a lot, and they crawl across the reef. They look kind of creepy, but they're really kind of cool too.
Okay. Antonio, yeah, what's your question?
I want to know how jellyfishes hide from sharks.
Ah.
Because every other fish can't hide from a shark. So I'm confused how a jellyfish can.
Okay. Do you have any questions about coral? Do you have a question about coral?
I do.
About this, what she was talking about? She said, how many corals are in the world?
Oh, I have no idea. We have about 26 different species of coral that we've identified on the shallow reefs at the Flower Garden banks, but other parts of the world have many more, especially in the Pacific. The Pacific part of the ocean is a lot older than the Atlantic part of the ocean, and there's been a lot more time to develop more species. So in the Pacific, over on the Great Barrier Reef, there's many more species of coral, and we don't necessarily have the same ones from one place to the next. So there's probably hundreds of species of reef building corals if you counted them all together.
Oh, good. Okay, Anika, do you have a question about corals? About corals?
Yes.
Okay, what is it?
My question is about the ones with the orange holes inside.
With the orange holes inside.
And with the
Are they on the screen?
yeah.
Which one?
These right here?
At the top next,
I thought we already talked about that.
the top right.
Okay, those are the Christmas tree worms that we talked about. Yeah,
Christmas
so
tree
they
worm.
they kind of like their tube is down inside the coral. So the coral has to keep growing around their tubes. They build a hard tube, and the main part of the worm, the part that looks like the earthworm you might see out in your yard, is down inside the tube, and just its pretty gills are out.
Okay, and last one. Javon, what's your question?
What's that thing on the top left?
Oh, you're so smart. Top left.
Top left, thank you. That was a good description. That is bacteria. That is a kind of cyanobacteria, which I don't know exactly what that means, but it forms this little like puffball thing out in the reef. So that's a kind of bacteria. It's something I don't know much about. Bacteria. That would be one of the simplest forms of life out there on the reef. And then they kind of build as you go across left to right and then down the page. And since there were a couple questions about sharks, let me point out that this is Shark Week, so I can go with that. And sharks are lots of sharks are a sign of a really healthy reef environment. If the sharks want to be there, it means that things are really going well and there's plenty of food there for them to eat. So having lots of these top predators around is a really good sign. There are over 350 species of shark in the world, and I don't remember off the top of my head how many we have at the Flower Garden banks, but we have at least 10 species of sharks out there.
Wow, that's amazing. We did get another question.
Okay.
So Benjamin asks, what can we do here at home to protect coral?
Well, my first words to you would be, the ocean starts at your front door. What you do in your own yard, in your own house, actually makes its way out to the ocean all the time. So the number one thing I tell people to do, even if you don't think you affect the ocean because you live too far away from it, is be nice to your water. Don't use more than you need. Don't pour nasty things into rivers and streams and lakes and ponds. Make sure that your trash goes where it belongs, doesn't enter the water. Don't use too many fertilizers on your lawn because that stuff runs off and then that ends up in the streams and lakes and rivers, and all that eventually leads to the Gulf of Mexico and out to the reefs out at the Flower Garden banks. And all those things can be bad for corals. So the very most important thing you can do living that far, as far inland as you guys do in Dallas, is make sure you're taking really good care of the water. Make sure there's plenty of water flowing to the Gulf, because if you use too much water, that's pulling it out of our rivers and streams and lakes and ponds, right? And that means we get less and less water in the Gulf. And that affects how salty the water is. And if the water's too salty or not salty enough, that's also a problem for corals and other things that live there. So everything you do at home that has anything to do with water affects the ocean. Keep that in mind. Good question.
All right. Does anybody else have any more questions? We've got a few more minutes.
Did you guys know that corals were animals? Yeah, you did? That's good. That's good. Most of people think they're rocks.
Very true.
Well, I'm so excited that you all got to join us today. I hope you learned something new, and I hope you take the chance to visit the website so you can remind yourself what you learned about today, and you can find lots of cool pictures and stuff there. And I know because I built our website. So most of the pictures you saw today are also on the website, and there's lots of great information out there. And maybe follow us, older kids and parents and stuff, on social media, where we post great images from the sanctuary. We're posting lots of shark pictures this week, of course, because it's Shark Week. But we give a good variety of stuff out there.
Very awesome. One more last minute question.
Okay.
Is it true sunscreen is bad for coral?
It just depends on the quantity. And there are sunscreens that are less problematic for coral. So there's a lot of debate on the whole sunscreen and coral thing. The truth is, any chemicals that get in the water have the potential to harm whatever's living in the water. And since people wear a lot of sunscreen to protect our own skin and protect ourselves, and then we go in the water, a certain amount of that washes off. If you're in a location where there's a lot of people all the time and a lot of that's washing in, yeah, it has a lot more chance of impacting the coral reefs, especially coral reefs near the coast. Coral reefs at the flower garden banks are more removed from the coast. They're over 80 to 100 miles offshore. So not as impacted by that, but just because it's diluted doesn't mean it's not there. So the best choice is to use the zinc-based, the mineral-based sunscreens. And make sure, if you look at something, just because it says reef safe doesn't mean it's reef safe. If you see anything para anything or oxy anything in the ingredients list, then that's not truly reef safe. Reef safe is not a regulated terminology. So just because somebody labels something reef safe doesn't mean it is. The best choices are any of your mineral-based sunscreens. They seem to have the least impact on coral reefs.
That is really good to know. Great question.
Yeah, really good.
Alrighty, so I think that is going to be it for today's program. Kelly, thank you so much.
Thank you.
For
And if you all
sharing.
send me numbers about how many people attended, that'd be great.
Awesome. I think we had somewhere around 35 to 36 people today, which is a great number.
Yes, awesome. Thank you very much.
All right. And everybody have a great rest of your day. Thank you for joining.